So today we're looking to create a interesting typographical graphic using Photopea. To begin, we're going to create a new document in Photopea. You're going to go up to File at the top navigation, go New. With our new document, I'm just going to rename this Text Intro. I'm going to change the width of the document to inches. And with the width itself, I'm going to put 12 inches and the height 8 inches. I'm also going to change the DPI to 150. That's dots per inch. And I can leave the background white for right now. And I can click Create. Now that we have our document created, we're going to look to modify this image. I'm going to go over first to the Type tool over on the left side navigation. I can click on the Type tool, and I'm going to click and drag to create a text box. With this text box, we want to first make sure that our color of the font is set to black. At the top navigation, I can see this black square. If you're seeing another color, just click on that area, and we can choose out the black area. But inside of this text box, I'm going to type in beans in all capital letters. B-E-A-N-S. And I want to highlight the text so I can modify the size of the font. To be able to modify the font, we're going to use the character panel. The character panel is over on the right side navigation. You'll see a number of different letters combinations. Each stand for a different panel that you can choose from. We're going to go to the CHA character. Within the character panel, we can do a lot of modifications to our text. The first thing I'm going to look to change is the size of the font. If I click on the drop down, the highest number that we can go to is 150 pixels. But if we want to modify the text even larger, we can change the number by specifically selecting out the 150 pixels and change it to 400. I can click enter, and then I have larger size beans. If at any point you'd like to modify the text, I can move my cursor right over top of the word size, and I can click and drag left or right to modify how large the text is going to appear. But for this image and graphic, we're going to start out with 400. The tracking modifies the space in between the letters. If I want to modify the space in between the letters, again, just like with the size, I can click and drag right on the word tracking to spread out the words. But I'm going to set this to 140%. And we're currently set up with the default font, which is Deja Vu Sans. We're going to change this to Helmet. When I click on the drop down for changing the font, rather than having to scroll down, I can simply type in Helmet. And when I select it, we see the new font placed in. The last thing I want to do is change the paragraph. At the top navigation, you'll see the character for the panel, and then right next to it is paragraph. I'm going to select the center justification, the second icon. That just centers beans within the document. Once I have beans built out with the correct font and size, I'm going to slide this down a little bit on my screen. And we're going to change the color of the font because we're going to change the color of the background. So I can go back to my Type tool and select right inside of the word beans. If I highlight over the 5 letters, we're going to change this to white because we're going to change the color of our background to black. To change the color of the font, I'm going to go again up to the top navigation. We'll see this black box underneath of the window, and I can click right on it. The color picker comes up, and I can click and drag the color of the font to white, or you can click on the default offered and click OK. So we can't currently see our text, but we're going to look to modify our background. To modify our background, we're going to select the background layer over in the Layers panel. Now that we have the background layer selected, you're going to go up to Edit at the top navigation, down to Fill, and change the foreground color down to black, and choose OK. Now we have Bean standing on the black background. Now that we have Beans, we need to separate it into 5 different layers. Each letter is going to be its own separate layer. I'm going to duplicate the Beans layer so that I can always go back to the file if need be. I can right click over on the Beans layer in the Layers panel, and I can hit Duplicate Layer. So I have a Beans copy. Now that I have the Beans copy, I'm going to hide the original Beans because I don't need that anymore. But again, I can refer back to that text later on if I ever needed to make modifications. With the Beans copy layer, we're going to right click, and then I'm going to go down to Rasterize. When I rasterize, you'll see that the capital T icon is no longer there. We now have a transparent background with the text as an image. So that means I can modify, erase, do separate modifications to the text now that it is a rasterized image. But with the Beans copy layer selected, I'm going to go over to the rectangle select, the second tool on the left side navigation. And I'm going to draw a box around the letter B. With a box around the B, I'm going to do Control C, Control V, which is copy and paste. If you're on a Mac, you can do Command C, Command V. And when you do the paste, you'll see that it comes up with layer 1. If I hide Beans copy, you'll see that the B is now on this layer 1. So I'm going to rename layer 1 B. And the most important part is that you go back to the Beans copy layer. With the Beans copy layer selected, I can go back to the rectangle select, draw a box over top of the E, Control C, Control V. And now if I hide the Beans copy layer, I have the E on its own separate layer. I can rename layer 1 E, and I'm going to repeat this process, going back to the Beans copy for A, N, and S as well. So click and drag over the A, Control C, Control V, rename the layer A, back to Beans copy layer, click and drag over the N, Control C, Control V, and finally the S of Beans. Click and drag over top of it with the rectangle select. Make sure, again, you're on the Beans copy layer. Control C, Control V, and rename that S. Now that I have these letters on 5 separate layers, I'm going to hide out the Beans copy. I don't need that anymore. And we see that we still have Beans going across. But if I unselect or hide any of the individual letters, you see that they disappear when I click on the visibility. Next, we're going to use the type tool to create out another word. Going back over the left side, clicking on the capital T, I'm going to click and drag to create a large text box. This time I'm going to type in the word cool, capital C, lowercase o, O, L. And we want to modify our cool settings for the text. So I'm going to highlight over top of the 4 letters. For our text, we're going to reset our tracking back to 0%. So it takes out the spacing in between the individual letters. The size of the font is going to go from 400% or 400 pixels to 800 pixels. So type in 800 in the size. Make sure that you have the 4 letters selected. And we have the larger cool. Now we're going to look to change the font. Instead of helmet, we're going to use Piñon. Piyon, script. When I change it to that script font, we see now that we have those cursive letters sitting over top of the word beans. I'm going to slide this down into place so it's sitting halfway above the word beans, right on the bottom edge. But we're going to look to rearrange our text. If I look at the layers panel, currently we have cool sitting above the word beans spelled out. I'm actually going to move the B, the A, and the S all above the cool layer. So we still have the E and N sitting behind the cool layer. I'm going to reselect the cool text layer and create a new layer that's going to sit above the cool layer. When I click on the new layer icon down the bottom right, we get layer 1. I'm going to rename this color. With our color layer, we're going to look to put in a gradient. The gradient can always be modified to your specification, but for this project, I'm going to look to change this to the spectrum gradient. So to get a gradient tool, I'm going to go over to the gradient tool on the left side navigation. It's about midway down. It's a little icon that transfers from white to black. Once I click on the gradient tool, I'm going to look to change out the default setting that they give us for a gradient. So I'm going to go to the top navigation. We'll see this large bar that transfers from black to white. I'm going to click on the drop down arrow, and we see that we have a number of different presets that we can choose from. I'm going to choose spectrum down on the bottom left side. It's a rainbow gradient that has a red left and right side. And with this gradient that I've selected, we see that it is now the proper gradient that we can use. I'm going to draw out a gradient that transfers diagonally from the left to right side of the page. And you'll notice that we see the BAS appearing above the rainbow gradient. It's because we're managing our layers, we have the BAS appearing above the color layer over in the layers panel. With this spectrum gradient, I can look to modify it. I can shrink it down, make it a little bit more narrow, or rotate it a little bit more. It is up to you as the designer to figure out what works best. If I want to modify the gradient at any point, I can click on this option of the rainbow gradient in the top left, and I can look to take out colors, clicking and dragging individual colors out if I want to make a custom gradient. So if I wanted to do just red, white, or red, blue, and yellow, I click OK, and then click and drag again to create that transition from red, blue, and yellow. But again, I'm going to end up using the default spectrum. Once I'm satisfied with that, I can look to now combine our color layer with our cool text. So over in the layers panel, I'm going to right click on the color layer. When I right click on the color layer, I'm going to go down and choose clipping mask. When you click on clipping mask, you see that the gradient now applies into the text of the cool layer. You'll see this little arrow appearing in the layers panel. So it's directly affecting the cool layer and nothing else. If I want to modify the gradient, I can use the move tool. I currently have the color layer still selected. And as I drag this left or right, you see that it affects the color of the text. But you'll notice that it will run out over on the edge. So make sure that it is not leaving off white areas. You can always go back with the color layer selected and redraw out with the gradient tool to modify the gradient how you want. But because we did that separation of the B, A, S, you'll notice that the B, A, and S all stand above the word cool, while the E and N are sitting behind the word cool. To help create a little bit more emphasis and make it stand out, I can look to add in a drop shadow on the 5 letters for beans. So if I select the B layer, you could use the auto select in the top left side navigation if you want to click directly on the letter itself. But with the B layer selected, I can go down to the bottom of the layers panel and click on the layer style, the little EFF, and look to put in a drop shadow. With the drop shadow, it will appear on top of the image and you see the shadow appearing over the subject. I'm going to just rearrange the angle and I can modify the distance so it's a little bit closer on the object. If I adjust the spread, you see that can blur over the top edge and bottom edge of the B. So I'm going to adjust the spread to 40%. The size, I'm going to make 20 for pixels. And the angle that I chose right now is 45%. You'll see that my opacity is set to 64%. Yours doesn't have to be exactly these numbers, but it gives you a good sense of how the shadow is going to cast on the object over top of the sea of cool. I'm going to look to repeat the same process for the other letters, for A and S. But we're also going to apply this same shadow to, or drop shadow onto cool as well, so it appears over top of the E and N. So with the A selected, I can go down to the layer styles, click on drop shadow. Everything is already set up based on our last setting, so all I have to do is click OK. Select out the S layer, down to layer styles, drop shadow, and it just has a little piece over top of the L of the cool. Click OK. And again, we're going to choose the cool layer and look to add in this layer style, drop shadow, and click OK again. So you see we created a little bit of dimensionality because we have these drop shadows over the letters. There is a longer process of painting in with the burn tool, but the most efficient way is adding the effects onto the layer style. And that is the demonstration. Once you've completed this, you can save the file, upload a PNG onto Canvas, and then we will look to create a project from the same process.